Merci beaucoup. C'est un grand plaisir d'être de retour au Canada. J'ai souvent visité votre pays, car le Canada joue un rôle important dans le monde. C'est un grand honneur d'être invité à adresser cette conférence. Je souhaite à tous une conférence fructueuse et je souhaite plein succès au gouvernement du Canada. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good to be back in Canada. Good to be back in Ottawa. And it's good to be here at this University of Ottawa, to debate ideas, to debate policies, and to debate actions that together shape our common global future. I congratulate the university for convening a conference on this theme and how Canada itself negotiates its future role in what is an increasingly complex future global order. And I also congratulate the Government of Canada for its recommitment to the centrality of the UN multilateral system and the important role and central role which that system plays in sustaining the global order of the 21st century. Friends, the United Nations needs friends. It needs friends to support it. It needs friends to defend it. It needs friends to reform it. And Canada is one such friend, not just now, but in a long and distinguished history going back to the San Francisco Conference. And therefore, what you are doing here today is not just of passing consequence, it's central to the role of an important country, a global country, in a time of great global challenge. This 21st century order of ours is indeed under fundamental challenge. Order itself in international relations is not an inherently self-sustaining concept. Those of us who have a passing interest in the history of international relations that would agree that notions of order, of global order, are a relatively recent phenomenon. And more recently again, the institutions charged with upholding such an order. In fact, there is a credible view in the international relations literature that order is not the natural condition of the international community. In fact, it is argued by some that the natural condition of the international community and of the society of states is one which heads in the direction of entropy, beyond entropy into disorder, and beyond disorder into chaos. And those of us with a passing history of the last century and the failure of the League and the birth and checkered history of the United Nations would be familiar with that argument. If we accept that order is not self-sustaining and that the institutions which are established to safeguard the global order are themselves not guaranteed of an institutional future, then it poses some fundamental questions for us all. How do we as responsible states in the international order sustain these institutions through agency, through the active intervention of states? Because it is only through such active, conscious and continuing intervention that we can in fact have some hope of sustaining the elements of the order into the future. And that again is where I come back to the role of countries such as Canada. I have long supported the notion of what is described in the literature as creative middle power diplomacy. If it's not in the literature, then at least I wrote about it. And I hope it's now in the literature. If not, I'll seek to ensure that someone does that in the Twitter sphere. But whether it's creative middle power diplomacy or whether it's creative constructive power diplomacy, the core question is this. Nation states in the world, such as Canada, who have as part of their DNA, but part of their conscious global mission, the maintenance of the institutions of the order. Many nation states participate in international relations to pursue exclusively their national interests. That's understandable, particularly if you come from realist or neo-realist traditions. But there are some states who have an additional national and international interest, which is to commit themselves explicitly to sustaining the health and vitality and relevance of the machinery of the international order itself as an additional added value to the global system. And that is the place and that is the category in which I place countries such as Canada at its best, countries like Australia at its best, and other such countries in the international community. It is an important value added. And if we were to sit here with those who crafted the Charter on our respective countries' behalves in 1944-45, that, I believe, would have been alive in the minds of many of them as well. Let's be clear about the fundamental global change drivers impacting on the order today. Number one, the globalisation of everything. If we were to fill this room with the literature on globalisation, we would need an annex. The subject of globalisation and all of its manifestations have been the subject of so much academic inquiry and at least political commentary that we are sometimes overwhelmed by it. But what are its drivers? Its drivers are essentially two things: the explosion in technologies and the explosion in finance, and technologies delivering rapid finance around the world, and the rapid transmission of other things as well, which lead to this extraordinary contraction of global space and time. Previous generations of political leadership have not had to cope with a globalisation of this level of intensity. And because of its driving dynamics in technology and finance and now beyond, it impacts every element of what we might describe as public policy. Not just the traditional domains of what you would describe as national security policy or foreign policy, by definition also, of course, international trade policy, but across all domains, the movement of peoples, the health of our communities, in addition to how we deal with existential challenges such as that of climate change and other challenges to the environmental order as well. The globalisation of everything. And with it, the collapse of what again the literature would describe as the great divide between the national and the international, the external, the internal, the global and the local. And we find ourselves in this uncertain terrain as a consequence of it. The second factor is the corollary of the first, and that is intense nationalist reactions to the globalisation phenomenon. We see this writ large across the countries of Europe. We see it writ large across the politics of the United States, where I now live and observe it up close and personal. This is an extraordinary and disturbing phenomenon for us all, as communities are often alienated by the forces of globalisation, conclude, or at least feel, that they no longer have a significant part or equity in the emerging globalised realities, and therefore react to the politics of the extreme. We see this phenomenon at large, and it is not just in the so-called developed world. It is across the world. A third factor, more complex of course, is the rise of militant fundamentalism. We see it writ large across the world today. Our hearts are enmeshed with those of our friends in Brussels, and earlier with those of our friends in Paris, with our friends in Lahore, with our friends across the international community, whether it's Istanbul, whether it's in Xinjiang, whether it's in Beijing. And the terrorist reality that we now face through this entire new breed of global non-state actors. This is a new change driver affecting the order as we all grapple as nation-states and as international actors and global actors with dealing with a reality which doesn't conform to any laws governing interstate behaviour. A new, great and violent global change driver. The fourth, I would argue, is this, the crisis of the nation-state itself. Nation-states, and I've had an experience of leading one, find themselves increasingly in no man's land. That is, the governance which they then provide themselves, often under the illusion of national sovereignty, incapable of reaching to the core of the questions which now affect its sovereignty and affect its peoples, whether it's in the economy, whether it's employment, whether it's investment, or whether it's in global people movements and the rest. Now increasingly saying to their national communities, either falsely, we can control these things as agents of national sovereignty, or in fact they now lie beyond our control, which leads to a further crisis in national political legitimacy. Which leads, of course, to a fifth change driver, and that is the poverty of our global governance in dealing with the same. We find ourselves in a new no man's land anchored between global governmental institutions, which are too weak to deal with global challenges, and national political institutions incapable of doing the same. And as a consequence, we have a further alienation of our peoples, our communities, our constituencies. And when we look across the array of global institutions today, whether it's the United Nations system, the Bretton Woods institutions, or the G20, of which I was a co-founder, each of them is deeply challenged by the adequacy of their substantive and substantial and change-making reach into the core of the problems now affecting the global order. And beyond all that again, we have the challenge of geopolitics and the unprecedented global reality we see in the rise of China. I've been a student of China now for more than 35 years. I've lived there, I've worked there in one capacity or another, engaging our Chinese friends as a prime minister, a foreign minister, a member of parliament, a businessman, an academic, across the domains. It is very rare in the world today to find a single institution of national governments in each of the 193 nation states of the UN system which does not have one form or other of daily conversation about China, because it impacts so fundamentally on the changing reality, in addition to the perceptions, of what constitutes the international rules-based system today. And this is an historic phenomenon. Remember when within the next decade, despite the naysayers on the growth of the Chinese economy, that China does become the world's largest economy, measured in market exchange rates and not just in purchasing parity pricing, that this will be the first time since George III unhappily sat on the throne of England, that the largest economy in the world will be non-English speaking, non-Western and non-democratic. This is a fundamental change driver across the world today. So welcome to the world of the 21st century. This is a period of unprecedented change, although each of our forebearing generations would have said the same about their own period in history as well. So, to paraphrase Lenin, what then is to be done, given the reality above? As was mentioned before, for the last 18 months, for my sins, I have chaired the Independent Commission on Multilateralism. Those of you familiar with the work of the International Peace Institute in New York and its offices around the world will know that it's been around for about half a century as a friend and supporter of the UN system. The IPI, in its wisdom 18 months ago, established the ICM, the Independent Commission on Multilateralism, to ask one single question of us, our co-chairs, our ambassadorial advisory boards, our foreign ministerial advisory board, which is the UN multilateral system fit for purpose for dealing with the challenges of the 21st century? This is a hard question. We've sought to be systematic about it. We've divided the UN in peace and security, in development and sustainable development, in humanitarian intervention, as well as in human rights, as well as budgetary questions, into 16 thematic areas, and we have been at work for the last 18 months with academics, with NGOs, with representatives of nation states, permanent representatives and others, working through each of these questions, each of these areas of UN activity, and asking again, is the current structure, functions and resourcing of the system sufficient for the purposes of the new global challenges of the 21st century? We will be in the business of publishing our report in the second half of this year, as we've said all along, and we have just now concluded the largest part of our external consultation process. My overall fear, having observed so many of these meetings now, and session after session, retreat after retreat, conference after conference, is that slowly but surely the United Nations system is dying the death of 1,000 cuts. And therefore, as I said in my introductory remarks, it behoves us all, as friends of the United Nations system, to put our shoulders to the wheel to bring the UN fully back to life for the challenges of the future. If we sat back and observed the questions such as the UN being absent from the table for the negotiations of the Iranian nuclear deal, the 5 permanent member states were there, plus Germany, but not the United Nations. If we observe the fact that on the Korean Peninsula we do not have any effective UN proposal for dealing with the nuclearization of the peninsula and the North Korean nuclear weapons program as a fundamental threat to peace and security, the fact that for 5 years, until most recently with the diplomacy of the Secretary-General's Special Envoy Stefan de Mistura, which I honour today, but 5 years into that process, we have been effectively missing in action in assisting bringing that extraordinarily bloody conflict to a close. The fact that we have a European refugees crisis, which is fundamentally a crisis of the refugees themselves, seeking peace and security and seeking a home and a refuge, where we have not delivered an effective global solution for dealing with global people movements over and above the current crisis, in a convention and an institution created to deal with challenges 50, 60 and 70 years ago. And, of course, there is the saga that is Ebola. Of course, we have our achievements. We point to the Paris outcome on climate change, and as a climate change activist, a climate changeista myself, in terms of international political participation, I regret we're probably about 10 years late, and at Paris we've agreed on 1/3 of the emissions reductions we need to in fact keep temperature increases within 2 degrees centigrade, and it is already a late beginning to what will become a long-term challenge for us all, which the international institutions must hold our feet to the fire on. We've also achieved success when it comes to the Sustainable Development Goals in creating a normative framework for eliminating poverty and ensuring sustainable development out to 2030, while leaving in suspended animation the great question of where does the finance come from to turn aspiration into reality. So, what thematics are emerging in terms of our response to these observations, passing observations, about where the UN finds itself in the 21st century? Here are 4 or 5 thoughts, at least, on how we can perhaps do it better in the future. 1, the UN, through its circumstances and through its creation, is in fact an institution of reaction. It reacts to crises, it reacts to wars, it reacts to humanitarian crises, and it acts, and sometimes very well. However, it is not an institution of prevention. And my argument here, very simply, is that if we are to engage effectively in the business of preventative diplomacy, it must be properly resourced. The United Nations needs a policy planning capacity of magnitude and scale to identify where all the fracture lines and fault lines are occurring around the international community, not just at the high point of the arrival of conflict on our doorstep, but the earlier warning signs, which we are enormously familiar with, given our study of the international system over the last 50, 60 and 70 years, the emergence of fragility, the emergence of the collapse of internal cohesion, and the emergence of ethnic conflict, and other such bellwethers or barometers of impending crisis becoming violent. Secondly, if it's to work beyond the planning capacity itself, we need to properly empower and resource the Department of Political Affairs, the United Nations system, to engage in large-scale political missions. You might think, well, that's what the DPA does, and I admire its work. But think about this. The total annual budget of the DPA is $20 million. $20 million. Our peacekeeping budget last year was $8.1 billion. You know, we all know the aphorisms about prevention being less expensive and more effective than cure. But when you put it into that numerical context, I think we have our relative financial weightings wrong. Preventative diplomacy can work. I draw attention to the example of my friend and colleague Jose Ramos Horta, a co-chair of the Independent Commission on Multilateralism and Nobel Peace Laureate and former President and Prime Minister of Timor-Leste. And when he was dispatched successfully by the UN Secretary-General to Guinea-Bissau over the last couple of years to deal with an emerging conflict with 6 months of patient political intervention as part of a political mission, as a fellow Lusophone and as someone who knew something of the local politics, or at least what politics was like as a previous practitioner in a difficult state of his own, frankly, stability was able to be restored in the absence of this becoming a matter of peacekeeping operations or peacekeeping forces. A second thought is this for the future. Integrated field operations. Our observation as a commission is that when it comes to the UN's presence in the field, integrated leadership through an empowered country leader is a gap in our current delivery. At present, the nature of the operation is this. Each of our arms of UN engagement in the field, whether it's through UNHCR, whether it's through World Food Programme or FAO or WHO or the other agencies, essentially answers, ultimately in policy terms, to their respective jurisdictions, be it either in respective institutional jurisdictions, either in Geneva or New York. That may well work well within a UN-centric matrix, but put yourself in the position of the receiving state, of the receiving community. It doesn't make sense. And if our interest is to deliver an effect and a sustained effect on the ground, and to have a person who is held accountable for the deployment of UN resources on the ground, I would argue that we need to look carefully again at how we coordinate our field operations with a single empowered and responsible person on the ground. A third observation about development. I mentioned before the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030. I fully support them. For my sins, additional sins, I'm chairman of the Global Sanitation Water Alliance. I'm now the Sultan of Global Sewerage. And so what we do with that is try to bring together the relevant parties on how on earth are we going to give effect to Sustainable Development Goal 6, just one of the 17, and the outstanding problems of 1.8 billion people today still engaging in open defecation, the problem of contaminated water, the problem which that leads to in terms of premature death, infant mortality and childhood and stunting. Well, the challenge, and having chaired its conference recently in Addis Ababa, is money. It's finance. And any of us who are realistic about what's available in the international community today need to focus on these core fundamentals. Total ODA today, less than 140 billion. In fact, less than when I was Foreign Minister of Australia a couple of years ago, because of the factors we're familiar with. Go to the balance sheet of the World Bank and all the regional development banks. Their balance sheets collectively, if stretched to the full, would not produce for you an additional $100 billion worth of activity in terms of infrastructure investment for the world at large. So therefore, unless the United Nations, in partnership with the World Bank and the rest of the international community, discover an entirely new framework for deploying global private finance into the infrastructure needs across the Sustainable Development Goals, across the world today, it won't happen. And we run a risk, frankly, of come 2030, when I'm sure all of us will be at the same seminar, here at the University of Ottawa again, then we will have this as this sign hanging over our heads against the deliverables outlined carefully and in a considered fashion by member states in the agreed document from September last year. The actual mobilisation, not the notional mobilisation of global private finance in partnership with public finance, in partnership where necessary with ODA, is the only way in which the quantum difference will be made. I'm conscious of the time. I also have thoughts on how we could do better with our system of global refugees management than we currently do at the moment, and of course on the future of the management through the international system of the great challenge of climate change. But mindful of the fact that we wish to have some discussion, let me conclude with some thoughts on Canada itself. Look, folks, you have a great history. Those of us around the world know more about it than perhaps you think. We're acutely conscious of Canada's long tradition of liberal internationalism. We're conscious very much of Pearsonian internationalism. We've studied it, we've read it, we've engaged it, we've felt it, and it's a good thing. And you make a difference in the world. Creative problem solving around the most intractable diplomatic, political and economic problems facing global governance in the world today is where Canada's brainpower and its global diplomatic network can be brought to bear. Canada's a G7 country. Canada also is what I would argue is a creative, constructive middle power. Canada has a long history of engagement in the politics and the reality of development. And for these reasons, I fully support the remarks made here yesterday by Foreign Minister Dion on Canada's principles for its own future global engagement, and to use the term which he used yesterday, a principle of responsible conviction. Turning this into reality will mean Canada working together with a coalition of like-minded constructive states in order to be the guardians, if you like, of the integrity of the system itself. Remember, a public policy goal beyond national interests, which is to sustain the global order and its machinery in itself. Canada is such a country. There are others like it as well, large and small, across the international community. A coalition of constructive powers who see the maintenance and the strengthening of the UN-based multilateral system as a core objective for their country's foreign policy. And with that in mind, I wish the Canadian government Godspeed. And with some help, and with some luck, and with some intellectual grunt, and with some policy heft, we can still keep the barbarians from the gate. I thank you.
Perhaps given time, we might just take 2 or 3 questions in a row.
2 or 3 questions in a row. I did start at 8:40. It's now 9:04, so I have run 9 minutes over time. I'm sorry about that. So a couple of questions, and then I'll try and respond to them. And if you don't have any questions, I'm delighted.
Sorry, I've got a question.
Sorry, I didn't see you over there. I didn't do it. That's the answer.
Fergus Watt with the World Federalists, the Canadian section, and my question is whether a UN that's fit for purpose will have a standing peacekeeping capacity. Whether this and the proposal that's out there that was considered by Mr. Ramos Horta, and parts of it were endorsed by the Commission on Sustainable Security, Justice and Governance, is the idea of a standing capacity as opposed to standby. I'm sure you're familiar with it. But I think this would go a long way to providing the preventive capacity as well as giving the UN the means to get in the field quicker. Yep. And I'm just wondering whether you agree with that.
Thank you. I'll take that question. Are there any others from the floor? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Prime Minister Rod. I'm also co-chair of another commission, as if we don't have enough commission, on the Commission on Security, Justice and Governance, which I co-chair with Mal Albright. And one of our conclusions is that the UN cannot do everything and should not be expected to do everything, particularly in the age and situation of lack of resources globally. I didn't hear you, however, mention other actors or partners, such as regional organizations, either in peace and security, particularly in Africa, as you know, the kind of job that the African Union is doing, civil society, parliaments, because we don't have the active engagement of world parliaments in sync with the General Assembly in addressing some of these issues. Perhaps you might wish to comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yes.
Oh, sir.
Mr. Prime Minister, I would like to ask you about...
I'm just grabbing a pen, by the way, while you speak.
Okay, grab a pen. I hope it's one of our pens. Roger Rickwood, University of Ottawa. You have a large number of mining companies that operate out of Australia, both inside and outside. Have you developed any kind of a regulatory framework for assessing the benefits or costs that these companies might engage in when they operate outside of Australia? There's been a lot of concern recently about multinational mining companies, particularly Canadian companies operating overseas and maybe not doing the best they can in occupational health and safety, environmental, working with Indigenous and local people. Is there any similar kind of scheme that Australia operates?
Thank you. I think there's a chap behind you there as well, and then we'll... yeah. Can I take...
Yeah, sure.
Sir, you go, and then I'll finish over here. Yep.
Hello, I'm Gabriel Swayze, a political science and common law student at the University of Ottawa. And I was just wondering if, you made mention of the UN having to adapt to modern day issues and challenges that face the world. But I was wondering if it's actually feasible, considering how quickly these challenges are changing and adapting at such a quick rate in what seems random or unpredictable at first. As they say, hindsight is 20/20, but in looking forward, it's not necessarily certain as to what's going to take place in terms of what new challenges will pop up for the world. So I was wondering if you had any sort of rock-based ideas on how to make the UN an organization that can feasibly prevent challenges that may pop up in the future.
Thank you. Great question. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prime Minister Rudd. I'm Margaret Biggs. I'm Queen's University, former president of Canada's CEDA. Two quick questions. The first one is to ask you to get the two parts of your heads, your China side of you and also your multilateral side of you, to comment on the role of China in this international order and how we, for its responsibilize China in terms of having them see a stake in helping to sustain a multilateral rules-based order. And then I have a second question, which is, if it's not too impertinent, we heard last night from Prime Minister Martin, another sort of co-architect of the G20, that the G20 perhaps is more fit for purpose to come to the aid of various weaknesses in the UN system, and I appreciate your thoughts on that.
Good, thank you very much. Let me take those in reverse order. So let's talk a bit about China. For the Chinese, when you use the term global order, when the Chinese talk about the international system, the language is quite interesting. In China, 国际系统, the word for international system, means the UN, and it means the Bretton Woods institutions, and it means the other plurilateral institutions. It does not mean great power politics. And what is plain to me, particularly given Xi Jinping's statement to the General Assembly last September, is that China plans to play a much more activist role within the institutions of the UN system. And you see evidence of that already. We all know the attitude taken by our Chinese friends at Paris, which was critical to the outcome on climate change. But two other things as well. China now, for the first time, beginning to participate, albeit at a smaller level, in multilateral aid delivery through the existing multilateral institutions, and not just bilaterally, and not just in aid in kind. And thirdly, relevant to another question which has been asked here, is Xi Jinping's statement to make available an 8,000-strong standing force from the People's Liberation Army for deployment. And remember, the Chinese now, amongst the P5, are the largest participants in global peacekeeping operations and already have a battalion on foot in, I think, Sudan? Thank you. So these are early evidences, I think, of an increasingly multilaterally activist China. Then, of course, the debate arises about the Bretton Woods institution and what China is doing with the AIIB. And by the way, I don't think the AIIB will be the last of China's innovations in terms of global financial arrangements. You already have the New Development Bank involving India, Brazil, and others. And you also have, or the BRICS Bank, and you also have China's new Silk Road Fund, and I think you'll see further innovations in China's global financial institution building around the development needs and infrastructure investment needs of Central and Eastern Europe. So the key question is this a breach of the Bretton Woods institutions, or is it a complement to the Bretton Woods institutions? Personally, I take a pretty philosophical view of this, which is one driven by the numbers. Here is the global infrastructure investment deficit. It's big. Here is the current availability of global public finance for the multilateral development banks. It's small. And here is ODA. It's microscopic. How, therefore, do you fill that gap? Well, part of it will lie with new financial institution building, and part of it will lie, as I said earlier, with the harnessing of global private finance. We in the Asia Society are hosting in Washington during the spring meetings of the bank and the fund Jin Li Chun, the new head of the bank, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in DC. I've known Mr. Jin for a long period of time. His determination is to build a system of governance within the AIIB, to use his own terms, higher than that of the World Bank. We'll see what Mr. Jin does, but I know that's his aspiration. I don't see evidence yet through that institution that the AIIB is stepping outside the norms of the Bretton Woods institution. Final point in response to that question is, but more to come. If you wouldn't mind, could we chat about your second question maybe over coffee? Because we've got a panel here and I've got a few other points to make. Otherwise, the moderator will haul me from the stage. My friend, the question about the UN adapting to circumstances and how can it anticipate change when change is random, rapid, often violent and incapable of anticipation. The world, as we all know, is not a zero-sum game. Some stuff just happens. But let me tell you, and excellent work done by Walter Kemp at the International Peace Institute on the predictive elements of crisis around the world, starting with the barometers of fragility and how you can actually map where crises are going to begin to emerge by the convergence of fragility factors, convergence of climate change factors, convergence of ethnic or internecine conflict, before you actually get to hot conflict. And actually, I think we can do a better job of anticipating that with one purpose in mind, not just to say, well, aren't we a clever bunch of folks? We predicted that, bang, it's still a disaster. The whole point of it is then to feed into what I describe as preventative political diplomacy through an expanded operation, the DPA. Mining corporations, not my biggest fans and supporters in Australia, BHP and Billiton and Rio Tinto, active campaigners against me, my government and everything I stood for. So how do I give a temperate response to that question? We need a more robust global regulatory system involving all of the global mining majors. I think IT is a great step in the right direction in terms of transparency. One of the aid programs which we developed when I was in office was a very large one, more than $100 million, $140 million, working with all the mining regimes across the 51 states of the African Union on the governance of those regimes in dealing with large-scale foreign corporations in the mining sector. In other words, how do you regulate foreign investment? How do you insist on your environmental standards? How do you insist on your labour standards? How do you insist on environmental cleanup after the event, etc.? So I'm with you, and that's a reflection of two of the things which we've sought to do, at least as Australia. On the question that you asked, Sir... Oh, good, sorry. I thought you were there. You constantly keep we Australians guessing. About the UN can't do everything. And thank you for the work, by the way, done by your panel and by Madeleine Albright, which I think is a very useful contribution to the debate on whether the UN is fit for purpose. And your core argument is right. The UN can't do everything. And so I have a simple proposition about that. Be clear about what we can do and do it well, first principle. Second principle, understand, as I've just said in relation to finance, that the UN at best is one player in a sea of 1,000, but use the unique convening power of the United Nations, given its inherent legitimacy as the society of states, based on principles of equal sovereignty, to draw together the other participants. I've just mentioned how that can be done in relation to financing for infrastructure, which will be the driving factor in delivering or not delivering on the Sustainable Development Goals. But beyond that, and you anticipated this in your question, we need a new compact with the regional organisations. I spent a lot of time in Addis in the last 12 months talking to our friends in the African Union about their levels of disquiet with the engagement of the UN system. I don't believe there's a monopoly of wisdom on either side of that debate, but I do think we need some clarity in terms of what is the best operational protocol between the two systems on peace and security, given the provisions of Chapter 4, I think, of the African Union Charter, and certainly the provisions of the UN Charter as well. Chapter 8, I'm sorry. And then on the question of global development generally, we have the terrific examples already of Garvey. We have the terrific examples of what's being done by Gates. We have the terrific examples of what's been done by the Global Fund. It's in office we have been, as Australians, huge contributors to these efforts. The global partnership model needs to be extended creatively, but anchored in my argument, the unique convening power of the United Nations system. None of these other outfits actually command the legitimacy of the UN system under the Charter and the equal sovereignty of states. But in terms of flexible delivery, where the UN does not need to be at the centre of delivery systems, but one of many, that I think is part of the pathway to the future. On the question of standing, I'll finish on this, on the question of standing military capabilities or standing peacekeeping forces, the United Nations system, in my own mind, the jury is still out. It's a controversial issue within the UN system. José Ramos Horta's report, the HIPPO report, is well argued. There are some responses from other states, and without seeking to be evasive in what I say, what I would say to you concretely in response is we are still thinking our way through on that one. However, the big footnote is this. You cannot walk away from a peacekeeping system in the face of the extraordinary incidences of sexual abuse that we've seen on the part of peacekeeping forces. I honour the work of peacekeeping forces and the great work that they do, but we need to lift our game corporately on dealing with this, frankly, this stain on the UN's flag, which has been the recorded instances of abuse. So, my friends, that's it from me. Thank you very much for your attention. But I believe, again, simply to start with the proposition at the beginning, UN central to the future. Churchill, democracy, bad system of government, except it's not as bad as all the others. United Nations system, the worst system of global governance, apart from all the others. Our challenge as constructive powers is to get in behind the United Nations system and to ensure that it is as relevant as possible to this vast array of new challenges for the 21st century. Because if we fail to do so, my fear is, because the order is not inherently self-sustaining and institutions are not inherently self-regenerating, that we could see the death of 1,000 cuts. Thank you for your time.